Hello, Dr. Bagchi and the rest of our neurotoxicology class. Our names are Adam Ayroso, Linda Cesark, and Aaron Comerford. For our neurotoxicology presentation today, we will be discussing the topic of lead toxicity. Here's just a sequence of areas we are going to be discussing with you today, including human and environmental impacts, toxicological and neurotoxic manifestation, dose and effects, molecular mechanisms, prevention and therapeutic strategies, and just a conclusion to wrap it all up. The first aspect we will be focusing on is mankind and environmental areas that lead lead toxicity can significantly alter and shape with negative consequences. It is ultimately reflecting why should we care. Based on past studies and statistics, some important numbers to note include that there are 1 million deaths per year by lead poisoning reported by the World Health Organization. Also, 1 in 3 children, with up to 8 million globally, have blood levels at or above 5 micrograms per deciliter, which is considered elevated. Lastly, 30% of idiopathic intellectual disabilities can be attributed to exposure in lead, with a high concern for development in children. This chart here shows the estimated number of children with elevated blood lead levels, as seen especially in higher parts of Africa and South Asia. Over a third of the world's children are affected by lead poisoning, reflecting how vulnerable children are to this toxic exposure. Moreover, reported in the World Health Organization 2021 update of the public health impact of chemicals, knowns and unknowns, a 2019 study reflected that an estimate of nearly half of the 2 million lives lost to known chemical exposures in 2019 were due to lead exposure. Lead exposure is also estimated to account for 21.7 million years lost to disability and death worldwide due to the long-term effects on health. This includes, as mentioned earlier, 30% of intellectual disability, but also 4.6% of global burden for cardiovascular disease and 3% of kidney disease. Although these numbers may seem small, it reflects a factor of impacting not just neurology, but directly influencing other organ-based systems and products of development. Based on the data, it demonstrates children are the highest at risk or most vulnerable to this toxicity. But why are children so vulnerable? Previous reports have shown that lead in dust and water can contribute up to 35% and 20% respectively to lead exposure in children's blood lead levels, as shown on the figure in the right by the pink and orange bars. Children are more sensitive than adults to elevated blood lead levels, as children's developing brains, nervous system, and other organ systems are very sensitive to lead. Differences between the adult blood-brain barrier and that of fetuses and very young children increases the risk of lead's entry into the developing central nervous system of the latter two. This can result in prolonged or permanent neurobehavioral disorders. In the study done by Lanfear in 2000 with the figure reported, an inverse relationship between blood lead concentration and arithmetic and reading scores was observed for children with significant blood lead concentrations. Childhood lead exposure can damage language function, academic achievement, psychomotor and behavioral development, reaction times, hand and eye coordination, and vocabulary and grammatical reasoning scores. A main source of lead toxicity is paint. Lead-based paints were banned for residential use in 1978. However, homes built in the US before 1978 are likely to have some lead-based paint. When the paint peels and cracks, it makes lead paint chips and dust. Children are exposed by chewing on surfaces coated with lead-based paint, such as windowsills and door edges. They can also be exposed if they eat flaking paint chips or eat or breathe in lead dust. Lead-based paint and lead-contaminated dust are some of the most widespread and hazardous sources of lead exposure for young children in the United States. Approximately 29 million housing units have lead-based paint hazards, including deteriorated paint and lead-contaminated house dust. About 2.6 million of these are home to young children. One specific area that I had directly learned about this is the crisis of lead exposure in Syracuse, New York. I am part of a joint degree program with SUNY Upstate Medical School, and 2 summers ago, I took part in summer programming at the medical school. One lecture, we had gone over case studies and reports on the lead exposure crisis there. In a 2022 study by Harvard, it reported that Syracuse has neighborhoods with the most concentrated poverty in the country. Neighborhoods lay in the shadow of the I-81 overpass, a highway dividing the city where poverty rates exceed 40%. When I drove to Syracuse, I passed some of these houses as they are near the center of the city, and from 2013 to 2020, an average of 26.5% of children tested had high blood lead levels in Census Tract 54, part of Syracuse's South Side, a majority Black neighborhood. In 2020, 32.5% of children had high blood lead levels in this tract. The tract is 84% Black and 40% live in poverty. The highly concentrated region is centered within this red circle in this map, where many children in poverty live and suffer from lead exposure. Data has shown that lead poisoning rates have increased during the COVID pandemic. Possible reasons for this could be due to an increase in home confinement for children, as education and other sports and activities were put on hold or either put on Zoom. However, despite this increase, there has been continued unsustainability and a lack of government support. In a news report, one child, Talia Williams, who's 2 years old, as shown in the picture, is seen as she drops her dolls and paint flecks on the floor of her playroom. She runs barefoot through the house, touching the walls her mom washes with bleach to clear paint dust. In areas stricken from poverty, some families do not have a choice in living in these types of homes. In Syracuse, this 3-bedroom house was sold for only $1,100 in 2019. However, there is this division or gray area where families are exposed to high amounts of lead and toxicity, and whether the government has the policies and funding to relocate these families and provide support to renovate these older style homes. Consequences stated by many families are that kids are held back in school, their speech is delayed, and they suffer from anemia. They can't comprehend what their parents and teachers are saying, and some are anxious and don't trust new people and situations. So far, many landlords have appeared more willing to pay the government fines than to actually renovate their properties, as it is not as costly, posing a stagnant situation for many of the families there. Continuing regarding the hardship many impoverished families face in Syracuse, one report had stated that the paint on the doors at each entrance tested more than 20 times the amount considered harmful. This report was announced in September 2023, reflecting the need for greater awareness and law actions. However, last year, a new city ordinance made peeling paint a code violation as serious as even faulty steps or bad wiring. Code enforcement officers are celebrating the tally after 1 year in action, tallying up to 3,034 lead violations issued and 1,674 properties that were brought into compliance for having high lead exposure. However, there are still many homes and children that need help in getting access to treatment for lead toxicity or resources to live in a more conducive and safer housing area. It should still be noted that adults can be vulnerable to lead exposure and toxicity. In occupational settings, workers in certain industries like construction, mining, battery manufacturing, and those involved in lead recycling or smelting are at risk. They may inhale lead dust or fumes or come into direct contact with lead-containing materials. Also, drinking water contaminated by old lead pipes, solder, or fixtures in older and outdated homes or buildings can lead to high lead levels. The bottom picture shows the difference between old lead pipings versus the new copper pipings, which doesn't rust as much. You can see the rust or degradation from the lead pipes and how that can be unsafe for drinking water. Other areas are from replacing lead-based paint in renovations or from living or working near hazardous waste sites. There are also various influences of lead toxicity on the environment. First, there is social contamination from industrial emissions, vehicles, and lead-based paints that can settle in soil and pose a risk to plants and animals. The top picture here is an area filled with lead soil where workers have to remove the chemical. Another area is water pollution and contaminated drinking water in aquatic ecosystems. These are commonly sourced from older buildings with lead pipes and fittings, as seen by the picture and stated earlier. These areas can pose risks to wildlife and effects of reduced reproduction, developmental issues, and death. Birds and fishes are particularly vulnerable as they can ingest lead from contaminated soil or from lead-based fishing weights and ammunition. These impacts on the ecosystem can lead to bioaccumulation, where lead can be accumulated in the food chain, going up the ladder and impacting a variety of organisms and their food supply.
In the next section, we'll be talking about the toxicological and neurotoxic manifestations of lead, as well as dose effects. Chronic lead exposure can affect many different systems of the body, including the central nervous system, as it can affect the brain by affecting concentration and memory problems. It also can affect the musculoskeletal system, which can lead to muscle pain as well as joint pain. It can also affect the peripheral nervous system, as it can affect hand-eye coordination and other fine motor skills, as well as the reproductive system, as it can negatively affect the fertility in adults. Symptoms of lead exposure can vary based on age. In children, it is commonly seen that there is intellectual and behavioral deficits, hyperactivity, deficits in fine motor function, as well as hand-eye coordination and reaction time. In adults, it is commonly found that lead exposure can cause hypertension, renal disease, cataracts, as well as nerve disorders. Extreme lead exposure can lead to a lack of muscular coordination, convulsions, as well as coma. Lead's main target is the central nervous system. The direct neurotoxic effects include apoptosis, excitotoxicity, which affects neurotransmitter storage, alters neurotransmitter receptors, mitochondria, and secondary messengers. These symptoms can also appear immediately after exposure or may be delayed and include memory, vision, and cognitive impairments. Dose and effect can vary based on the age and stage of life an individual is in. There's prenatal exposure, which happens in utero via maternal contact. It can happen in children from playing in the dirt, as well as putting their hands and objects in their mouths, as well as adults, which can be exposed in the workplace or could be suffering from delayed symptoms from childhood. So, in the next few slides, we'll be analyzing deeper the dose and effects for each group. Prenatal exposure has been confirmed that the mother can transfer lead into the bloodstream of the fetus. Not only can this be transferred via the umbilical cord, but it's also found that lead could be transferred via breast milk after the child has been born. Prenatal lead exposure has been found to impair cognitive development in the infant. Lead exposure in children. Children are at a higher risk because they play in dirt, as mentioned before, as well as constantly putting things in their mouths. The consequences of lead exposure are a high risk factor, specifically in children. This can negatively affect the learning process and developmental processes. Common symptoms of lead exposure, of a chronic low dose exposure, are proximal muscle weakness of the upper extremities and foot drop. In adults, chronic low-dose exposure could lead to symptoms such as asymmetrical weakness of the wrists, also known as wrist drop, with no loss of sensation. Extensors of the fingers and thumb may be affected before the wrist, and proximal muscle weakness of the upper extremities and foot drop in severe adult cases. More specifically, for lead dosage, lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter are considered elevated. Impaired abilities may occur at blood lead levels, also known as BLLs, ranging from 10 to 25 micrograms per deciliter. Symptomatic lead intoxication BLLs range from 35 to 50 micrograms per deciliter in children and 40 to 60 in adults. Severe lead toxicity is associated with BLLs of 70 micrograms per deciliter or higher in children and 100 or higher in adults.
In this last section, we're going to be talking about the mechanisms, treatment, and prevention options. So for the molecular mechanisms, lead, it can disrupt neurotransmitter activity, which leads to alterations in cellular and molecular targets. It has interactions with other metals, such as zinc and iron, affecting their absorption and utilization. And it decreases adenyl cyclase activity, which inhibits the cytotoxic function of human natural killer cells, and also reduces dendritic complexity, which reduces the activity of the neurons. So for the prevention methods, the first primary prevention method is to remove the lead hazards and increase public awareness. So by removing lead paint, lead-based gasoline, and lead in soil and water, these are the first lines of defense against lead exposure. And that quote, you could see, prevention is better than the cure. And increasing the public awareness by educating and empowering communities to recognize and address potential sources of exposure, we ultimately are able to safeguard their public health. The secondary line of defense includes blood testing and follow-up care. So early detection and intervention allows for a timely identification of elevated lead levels and implementation of interventions. And the follow-up care ensures the reduction of lead toxicity and the mitigation of potential health risks associated with continued exposure to the lead. So for therapeutic strategies, the main strategy is the chelation therapy. The chelating agents bind to heavy metals like lead in the bloodstream. In lead poisoning, it facilitates the elimination of lead ions from the body, preventing further organ and tissue damage. And the main chelating agents for lead poisoning are EDTA, BAL, DMSA, and D-penicillamine. And on this image on the left, we can see this is an example of EDTA removing heavy metals from the bloodstream. So it binds to those heavy metals, and then those are taken out of the bloodstream. So, in conclusion, lead toxicity poses significant risks to the environment, contaminating soil and water, endangering wildlife, and impacting ecosystems through bioaccumulation. In mankind, it threatens public health, particularly affecting children's cognitive development, causing neurological damage, cardiovascular issues, and reproductive problems, emphasizing the urgency for regulations and public awareness to mitigate its far-reaching detrimental effects. Lead can affect many systems of the body in various ways and is dependent on the dosage. The effects of lead varies from prenatal development, children, and finally to adulthood. Lead toxicity interferes with neurotransmitter and adenyl cyclase activity, reduces dendritic complexity, and can interact with other metals. And prevention measures include removal of lead toxicants and blood tests for detection, while treatments mainly include distillation therapies. And here are our references. Thank you for listening.